In this presentation, we will review the SQ3R+R process, or survey, question, read, recite, review, and relate. The SQ3R+R process provides a structured system for recursive reading and thinking. There are several terms in this brief definition that we need to define from the outset before we dive into the individual stages. The kind of thinking we're referring to is critical thinking, which involves analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. In analysis, you're breaking down the text into its component parts. For instance, in a work of visual art, you might ask questions that focus on just the lines or just the color. In synthesis, you are combining information. For instance, you might apply historical and cultural contexts that you found in research to a reading of a cultural artifact. And finally, in evaluation, you're discerning the artifact's value. You might ask, for instance, is it good or bad, true or false, beautiful or ugly, useful or useless, etc. The SQ3R+R process facilitates critical thinking of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. We refer to the SQ3R+R process as a reading process, but it's not just for reading written texts or oral literature. It's for thinking about any cultural artifact. We're thinking by reading into the text, and the text includes any cultural artifact, such as, but not limited to, textbooks, food, fashion, architecture, songs, paintings, speeches, plays, etc. Finally, the SQ3R+R process is a recursive one. This means that the stages in this process recur or happen over and over again, and not necessarily in any particular order. You may have heard of the phrase recursive writing process, which refers to pre-writing, writing, and rewriting. A recursive reading process is similar. It refers to pre-reading, reading, and rereading. The stages of the SQ3R+R process can happen during any of these pre-reading, reading, and rereading phases, and thus are recursive. Now take a moment to think about your own reading habits. Pause the video and write down what you do when you're preparing to read, while you're reading, and after you've finished reading. What are your reading habits? When you're done, hit play again. As we go through the SQ3R+R process, try to match what you already do to this formal system. Many of the things you already do are likely to appear in this video. The purpose of learning about the SQ3R+R process isn't to reveal something necessarily extraordinary, but rather to outline a formula that can help ensure that we're doing everything we're supposed to be doing every time we read, to help us get the most out of every cultural artifact. So let's begin, and again, let's keep in mind that all of these stages can be repeated, and there's no essential first stage in this process, so we're starting a bit arbitrarily with survey. What does survey mean to you? When we hear the word survey, we might think of questionnaires or surveys that collect information from participants. You might also think of land surveyors who collect information about properties. Or you might think of the word surveillance, which implies yet another kind of information collection. Surveying in the SQ3R+R process is exactly this. You're gathering information, and you're doing so by scanning three things: the text, the context, and yourself. When you scan the text, you're scanning for the things that stand out, like the title of the work, chapter and section headings, or back matter. You might also determine at a glance what kind of artifact you're looking at. Is it a science fiction novel, a political speech, an illustration, etc.? Determining these superficial pieces of information helps to inform our focus and expectations. When you scan the context, you should be searching for background information, which can include historical and cultural contexts, as well as the author's or artist's biography. You can find this kind of information in prefaces and introductions to texts. This is also when you should be Googling or looking things up on Wikipedia to make sure you're initially oriented to the text. Finally, when you scan yourself, you're looking for what you already know and think. Do you have pre-knowledge about the subject? Or is the subject entirely new? And what might your biases be? These can be positive and negative biases. Perhaps you love the author or subject at hand and feel you're the utmost expert on it. Or maybe you hate the subject, or it bores you, or you think it's fairly simple and straightforward with not much depth. All of these are biases, and potentially delimiting. They can stop us from getting any real substance out of the text. So be aware of your biases, what you already know and what you don't know, and reflect on how these things may expand and/or narrow your approaches to the text. Let's leave the question stage for last, since it's most exciting and involving, and move on to read. There are two types of reading, active and passive reading. Passive reading happens when our eyes are moving over the text, but we're not really taking anything in. This happens a lot when we're tired or distracted. Active reading involves engaging the text, or having a conversation with the text. In our class, we'll be citing in MLA style, and in MLA style, we generally speak in the present tense. This is different from citation styles used for the sciences and social sciences, where studies conducted in the past remain in the past tense. When we use the present tense in MLA style, we do so because the text is constantly made present by us conversing with it. We have conversations with the text by annotating it or taking notes. This means writing, highlighting, underlining, keeping index cards, or otherwise somehow notating the text. When we actively read, we should take note of three things: the interesting, the important, and the confusing. You can annotate confusing things by simply putting question marks next to them. This could be a word or context you don't understand. These are questions you can note so that you can answer them later. You can annotate important things by underlining them. These could be main ideas or particularly relevant pieces of information for your own projects and research. Maybe things that you agree or disagree with, or feel otherwise particularly valuable, practical, beautiful, etc. Finally, especially be sure to annotate the things you find interesting. Humans are really good at pattern recognition. We often recognize patterns without knowing what they mean or why they're important. So trust your gut instincts. Let your instincts show you what to focus on. Even if you don't yet know why this thing sticks out to you, mark it. And as you start to compile information from all the stages of the SQ3R+R process, you'll be able to start getting a clearer picture of how everything fits together, and you'll be able to begin articulating what that pattern actually is. Annotating is overall important because it also helps us to retain information. All attentive students remember about the same amount of information from class, whether or not they take notes. However, the practice of taking notes means you're making deliberate decisions about what you want to remember. So rather than a random assortment of trivia, you can ensure you're remembering the things you deem notably interesting, important, and confusing, so that you may analyze, synthesize, and evaluate later. After all, you can't think critically about something you don't remember. This takes us to the recite stage, where we repeat the information we have thus far to check for accuracy and comprehension. Reciting is the stage where you summarize, and importantly, summary does not just talk about what a text says. It also articulates how the text conveys its ideas, attitudes, and values. For instance, someone might argue that the logical fallacies in a political commercial actually facilitate rather than hinder its messaging. Here, the logical fallacies are the vehicles for the ideas. They are the how for how the ideas are conveyed. A summary of that commercial would tell us what the message is, as well as identify the logical fallacies that convey that message. We've all been summarizing since primary school. Summaries are an important tool for effectively orienting our audiences to the cultural artifacts and research we're working with. But when tasked to summarize, it's very often that we focus on just the what's. So keep in mind and remember, an effective summary is not just what a text is about, but how its ideas are conveyed. Summarize as you read, at the end of sections or components of a text, and after you have finished the entire text. Rephrase into your own words, connect sections as you go, and through this series of repetition, you can also further reinforce your memory of a text, and thus your ability to think critically about it. The next stage sounds a lot like the previous. It's called the review stage. This is where the major synthesis and evaluation happens. In this stage, you review everything you've done elsewhere in the SQ3R+R process. You can unite the contextual information from surveying with analyses you've developed during the question and reading stages. You can answer remaining questions from your annotations, reread passages you have marked, and challenge your previous conceptions or identify further support. The review stage is where you give your argument distinct shape and perspective. It is also the stage where you bring your perspectives to your community for review as well. The review stage is not just for you to individually review your work, but for others to peer review your work and see if your argument and perspectives hold water. The final R stands for relate. I always say to students that the SQ3R+R process is named the way it is not because cultural scholars are bad at math, but because not everyone agrees that the final R belongs. Relating is the process of finding connections with the text through your own experiences, expressions, and observations. So, relating implies something subjective, but it is important to remember that subjective knowledge is not false knowledge. Subjective knowledge is knowledge based in an individual subject, for instance, you and me. This is opposed to objective knowledge, which is knowledge gathered via objects, for instance, tools, equipment, and institutions. Both subjective and objective knowledge are incomplete knowledges that require each other to provide holistic perspectives. So, when we relate to texts, it's not just because it's important for us to find connections with and interests in the text, but because it's important for us to contribute our particular understanding of the text to our communities. In the field of literature, there's often this romantic assumption that readers read by themselves, at a windowsill, sipping our tea, all by our little lonesome. But reading is not an individual act. It's a communal one. When you read, you're contributing to a vast network of information of which you are a relevant part. This brings us back to the question stage, which we had skipped earlier. Like the other stages, questioning should occur before you read, while you read, and after you read. While the review stage is our primary stage for synthesis and evaluation, the question stage is our primary stage for analysis. In questioning a text, we deconstruct or dissect it into its component parts for examination in order to later compose, synthesize, and draw conclusions. There are two sets of questions you may ask. There are the journalistic questions, who, what, when, where, why, and how. And there are the questions presented by Kenneth Burke's pentad, which refers to 5 rhetorical elements. These pentad elements include the agent, agency, scene, act, and purpose. The Burkean pentad can be correlated with the journalistic questions, but the Burkean pentad also helps us to push our questioning a little further to give us greater perspective and make us think in ways we normally wouldn't. So let's start with agent. An agent is an entity or thing that acts or causes a reaction. Where there are effects, the agent is the cause. We might at first assume that the journalistic question we can correlate with agent is the question, who? For instance, we might say that it is the main character that propels the plot. But agents can also be what's, or things and objects. For instance, a storm may also propel a plot. A storm can drive 2 people together or apart. In a classroom, we readily identify students and teachers as agents because they're acting. Students are learning, teachers are teaching. These are examples of agents that are whos, but books in the classroom can also be agents. Books have been banned because of the anxiety around how they affect people and shape how we think and thus behave. Books act upon us and thus are also agents. Already, we're beginning to see how the Burkean pentad can challenge the assumptions we have under the journalistic questions. Normally, under the journalistic system, We might simply look at the whos, that is, the characters or people, as those responsible for causing things. But asking about agents rather than just who allows us to think about how things, like institutions or commodities and the environment, can also have significant effects. Let's move on. Agency is the tool that facilitates the action. When we match up agency against the journalistic questions, we can say that agency asks how things are done. Again, normally under the journalistic set, we might assume a tool must be an object or thing. But like agents, agencies can be both whos and whats. For instance, in a classroom, a pen is an agency. It facilitates the act of writing. At the same time, the teacher is also an agency. We are tools for facilitating student learning. Asking questions through the pentad thus again allows us to see how various parties play multiple roles, are related, and impact each other. Act may seem simple. It refers to the question, what happened? But when you ask this question, consider those things that happen not just materially, but immaterially. For instance, in a classroom, writing is a physical act. Learning is an intellectual act. Scene tells us when and where an action took place. For instance, a class might be set in the mornings in room 101, but there can be multiple ways to define the parameters of your scene. Saying a classroom is set in the mornings in room 101 suggests a simple and mundane daily lens. It's vastly different from saying the classroom is set in South Florida, which could imply something about regional cultures and politics, and still, this is different from saying the classroom is located in the Milky Way, which might imply something more sci-fi, ecological, or futuristic. In the same way, we can also dilate the time from talking about just mornings to talking about a particular season, which might lend the scene a mood, or even broader, identify the time as in the 21st century, which might imply certain technological and political circumstances. How we articulate the scene allows us to then perceive a situation through different perspectives, like adjusting the lens on a microscope or telescope. Finally, purpose refers to the whys, all the whys. Why did a character act the way they did? Why did the author write the text? Why are we reading or examining it? Ask why for all angles and dimensions. In every case, it's important to recognize the ways each pentad element helps to explode our usual daily journalistic questions, to give us a kaleidoscope of perspectives. The really exciting part in the question stage comes from using Burke's pentad to create ready-made analytical questions. You can do this by combining two pentad elements into what's called a ratio. We combine them by asking, how does one pentad element impact, shape, or influence another? For instance, in a classroom, we might ask, how does the scene impact the act? And we can specify the scene as a modern-day South Florida classroom, and the act as learning. In this case, the question altogether becomes, how does the modern-day South Florida scene impact student learning? Analytical questions help us to understand and appreciate cultural artifacts. It's not always easy knowing what to ask, and so being able to create ratios through the Burkean pentad helps us to invent questions and practice analyzing until we feel more confident devising questions on our own. Let's review. The SQ3R+R process stands for survey, question, read, recite, review, and relate. It helps us to consider ideas and perspectives that we may not have initially considered. To properly use this process, you should reapply each stage expansively. Net as much information as possible before you begin shaving down or discounting ideas to compose your arguments. Know that through this process, interpretation is not arbitrary. A cultural artifact can only support ideas that can be justified by its contexts and text. At the same time, depending on perspective and angles of approach, there can be multiple interpretations that comprise a holistic understanding of the cultural artifact.